There's a reason why I'm doing this one on the Patreon only and not on the main channel, and that is because the change the date debacle is a largely divisive culture war that has achieved absolutely nothing in the last 10 years and has actually further contributed to lack of a common identity across Australians. And so I decided not to do this one on the main channel because I don't think it's important around an election. I think if this is the kind of thing you are casting your vote on, I think you are majoring on the minor when it comes to politics. And ultimately, probably, I don't want to sound condescending, but falling for the distractionary play a little bit by getting so animated over something that doesn't really impact day-to-day lives at all. And I guess taking your attention away from economics, which is the majority of politics, I would say. So I haven't decided to do this one on the main channel, but I actually do have some pretty strong thoughts around how to possibly navigate change the date moving forward. So you guys get to be the sounding board for them. Today I'm going to put forward 5 possible solutions for navigating the change the date debacle. Now, off the bat, what do I think on change the date? So obviously, taking aside the point that I think it's a distractionary debate that achieves little, I do still have thoughts around what to do. And probably the way I'd understand it is similar to, say, Paul Keating talking about changing the national flag or something like that. Not from like a woke, no pride in genocide, not the date to celebrate, not for sloganeering or anything like that. But instead for vision and capturing excitement in a country. And how can we animate a country with excitement and create a strong national identity that weaves people together rather than have a weak national identity that might be prone to things like division. And so I'm hoping to come at it from this angle today rather than from the opposite angle of just trying to tear down an institution that's been put there over decades and I guess historically celebrating for centuries. But yeah, today I'm going to kind of consider 5 opportunities that I think would lead to better outcomes than what we currently have. So off the bat, I'm going to say this. I think we should change the date. And that's not from, that's no sense of judgment on anyone that celebrates Australia Day. I celebrate Australia Day by just kind of having a lazy day pretty much. I'm not conscientiously objecting. So when I say I think we should change the date, it's because I think there's more exciting opportunities moving forward. It is not a show of moral judgment on anyone who does choose to celebrate Australia Day at all. I think that's ridiculous. And you see people at the beach that are like, I'm only here at the beach because I want to go to the beach, not because I'm celebrating Australia Day. It's like, oh, whatever. And so the aim is to try and capture people's excitement. And the reason why I think we should change it to Australia Day is because if we don't act now, we're never going to build national consensus around a day to celebrate. So right now, if we did a referendum to change the date in Australia Day, I can probably lose like 75-25 at best. So just the whole idea of change the date, it's never going to work. What I think needs to happen is a conversation needs to happen around the exact date it should be changed to. And it should be very much positively spun as an excitement and as an opportunity to have an even better day to celebrate Australia Day moving forward. You're never going to get there by just saying no, not good enough, because that's just going to peeve people off, because people, when they hear change the date, they don't hear move it to another day that's more exciting. What they hear is you're not allowed to have pride in your country. And if that's the common message that's going through, it's never going to work. Obviously, Albo would never hold a referendum on that, particularly after The Voice. So I don't think it's getting changed anytime soon. But if a conversation isn't started around a positive date to move it to, then the Overton window for moving Australia Day is just going to go entirely because people will just become so entrenched on both sides of the debate. And it already is reaching that point. Again, I would say very few people are actually entering change the date with some form of an open mind. It's basically either woke nonsense or evil genocide, and that seems to be the way the cookie crumbles. So if I was a dictator and I was just to mandate what we would do with Australia Day moving forward, and as a dictator, that would be my number one priority, not about none of that foreign relations nonsense, none of that economics nonsense, just straight to the bread and butter issues. When do you celebrate Australia Day? What I would do, I would grab the King's birthday and I would chuck that on January the 26th. So one of the biggest obstacles to changing the date is just the fact that it's a brilliant time of year to have a day off. Again, the year's just slowly started away. Weather's great. Cricket or tennis is on TV. No one wants January the 26th actually touched. Even for Triple J moving Hottest 100 whenever they moved it a couple of years ago, the fact that it was just moved marginally a couple of days forward, was probably saved them to some extent, but it clearly isn't the same thing as what it used to be. But that also is kind of somewhat of an indictment on Triple J. And so first thing I'd do if I was dictator, I would move the king's birthday and then I would chuck it on January the 26th. And I think that's kind of appropriate because I think it's actually celebrating the British part of our national identity in a way that links it to Australia. So King's birthday is just, obviously, and it's not actually his birthday, is just, yep, day off, how good's the royal family, they're giving us a day off. If we actually connected it to Australia and go, we're celebrating the king, or our king on this day, and the reason why we're celebrating it on January the 26th is because that was when the British flag was planted in Port Jackson. And so that actually links the Australian identity to the British identity. And it's, I think, an appropriate way of celebrating the British part of our Australian identity. So for anyone that's like, oh, this is woke nonsense, it's like, actually, we are celebrating specifically the British part of our identity. And we are giving that kind of a day of honour and recognition. For people that are like, your Lydia Thorpes of the world, well, nothing is ever going to be good enough for them. So don't worry about them and don't remotely try and cater to those people because they're just going to say, well, you're celebrating genocide, you're celebrating an evil imperial family, and it's just going to go on and on and it just won't get anywhere. So I would put the King's birthday on January the 26th. Everyone still gets January the 26th off or the adjacent long weekend around it the way we do it right now. Go out, enjoy the tennis, enjoy all of it, and we can celebrate, I guess, our links to Britain. And the fact that the king is our current head of state, and as long as that lasts, I think the king's birthday would be great to have on January the 26th. I do not think that January the 26th should be Australia Day, and it's not because of genocide. Genocide happened, like, you look at the frontier wars, they took place over all 365 days of the year. You pick a day for Australia Day, you're going to find one of those days at some point in either the 1700s or the 1800s, or even if you look at the stolen generation in the 1900s, at some point, you're going to land on a day that had very adverse impacts for Indigenous Australians at some point. It happened over all 365 days of the year. So when it comes to change the date, kind of the whole no pride and genocide thing doesn't really stick with me at all, because actually, like, it was the planting of a flag. Like, that's what it was. Why I do have an issue with January the 26th is because it leaves Indigenous people out of the construction of Australia. Because it's calling it Australia Day is akin to saying Australia was made with the planting of the British flag. And that is leaving out half of the equation as to what makes Australia. Or I'd argue a third. You think of what is the melting pot of modern Australia? It's British white settlers, it's post-World War II migrants, and of course, it's Indigenous Australians. And all three of those have contributed to the national Australian identity that we have right now. And the reason why our identity is distinct from both Britain and America is because of those three things. Again, like you guys like Western Sydney, it's got a huge migrant flavour. You look out throughout all of Australian history, and Indigenous people have contributed to, even just in the kind of the settlement period, Indigenous people have contributed heaps throughout it, and we'll kind of go through a couple of different ways I think we can honour that. And then, of course, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely rule out the British part of our national identity as well, because it's huge. It's our language that we speak, and a lot of our political customs are inherited from Britain. And so I think it would be absolutely nonsense to say Australia Day should not have any component of celebrating and honouring British contributions to Australian society, knowing that all contributions to any society are going to come with a mixed bag of good and bad. And so for me, Australia Day, or January the 26th, is not an appropriate day for Australia Day because I think that it actually leaves out the contributions that people have made to Australia. And have left, and again, it doesn't account for Indigenous people in the construction of the Australian identity. We're saying Australia began when Britain came here, and that actually isn't true. Part of Australia came when Britain came here, but we are not British in our identity. We are Australian, and so we have to think about how we honour all those people who contribute to the national identity. The other thing that I don't like about January the 26th is because people propose a half-half day. So half the day is a day of mourning, half the day is a day of celebration. I think that's not. I think that is not actually that helpful, because it gives people mixed messages around what they can do on Australia Day, and I think we want to go the July the 4th route, and I think we want to again have people take pride in their national identity. Again, I think we just rely on the history curriculum to inform students on the fact that Australia doesn't have a perfect track record, as no country has a perfect track record when it comes to their history. And I don't think, in wanting to kind of balance both sides of it, January 26th is a sticky one because to do it justice, we do need to remember atrocities that came with colonisation. But is that really what you want to have on your day of national celebration? Again, I guess, am I making a possible anti-woke argument against Australia Day? Maybe. That you just have a day where you can celebrate and feel patriotism around the country that you have. And on January 26th, you can't really do that because it's seen to be in very poor taste. And also, it isn't appropriate because there does need to be a level of acknowledgement of atrocities that came. So as a starting point, what I would do is I would have the King's birthday on January 26th. January 26th would not be called Australia Day. It would be called the King's birthday. Celebrate all things British about the Australian identity. And again, because we are not saying that this is Australia and the planting of the British flag made Australia, we're saying this is the King's birthday and we're specifically celebrating the British part of our national identity. I think that gets the best of both worlds. And I think really, if all people are probably fundamentally getting triggered about is they're not going to be able to wave their Australian flags quite as much, and they can't use the word Australia. They use the word King's birthday. I think that would be a good starting point. The next question then is, when do you put Australia Day if you're not going to have it on January the 26th and you're going to have the King's birthday on January the 26th? And I have 5 possible ideas that I think could make for a very interesting Australia Day conversation. So we'll count ourselves down. We'll go from 5 and we'll go all the way down to 1. And starting at number 5, I am going to put August the 14th as a possible date for Australia Day. And I'm sure you're thinking, what happened on August the 14th? It's not really ringing any bells. I don't even remember the year. That's terrible of me. 1948? I'm pretty sure 1948 was the year. Anyway, the day Bradman got a duck. And that is... and I think that would be a fun way to celebrate Australia Day for a couple of different reasons. One, cricket's the national sport of Australia. As much as people say it's footy, footy's too divisive amongst codes. Victoria and New South Wales have different things that come to mind when you say footy. So would Queensland and Western Australia. So cricket is a unifying sport that people love. And Don Bradman is just in a league of his own when it comes to dominating sports. Again, like in no other sport is the conversation as clear as when it comes to who the GOAT is, when it comes to Don Bradman. I think PY made a really good point on the podcast. Again, so you said, one thing you said was that Don Bradman's batting average is 35% higher than pretty much the second best of all time. So that's insane that he's 35% above the second best. And people would then say, well, yeah, it was much easier in his time than it was for other people. Why didn't anyone else get a 99.94 average the way Don Bradman did? I think it also channels a bit of Australian spirit that we can laugh at ourselves, that we don't demand perfection of ourselves, because it was the day that Bradman fell from perfection. It was his last innings. What did he need to get? Like 5 runs to avoid, or to keep his average above 100, which would just be insane. And he got a duck, so he didn't get that. And so I think it'd be a fun way that we could laugh at ourselves, be like, look, we have this great icon, we remember the day Bradman got a duck, and actually channel the Australian identity that we don't take ourselves too seriously. I think that could be a fun way of going about it. The cons is that it doesn't have an Indigenous element about it, so it doesn't really, I guess, pick up, or it doesn't really solve the issue of the fact that we can't find a date to celebrate that includes all parts of the Australian identity. It doesn't really include migrant culture either, because we're talking from the 1940s, and so the post-World War II migration was only just starting to begin at this point, and so it has its cons. I don't think it's the best solution out of the 5 that I'm going to put. That's why I put it at number 5. But I do think there is potential to just have something like this where you kind of laugh at ourselves and don't take ourselves too seriously with the Australian identity. The other con about it is that it falls in winter. So it would be a good substitute for the King's birthday, because currently we have one in winter, one in summer, and under the current arrangement, or this proposed arrangement, we'd have one in summer, one in winter. And so it would keep that balance. But would you want to celebrate Australia Day on August the 14th? Again, maybe you could tune into some NRL or something like that, but there wouldn't be cricket or tennis on in the background. So for me, that is option number 5, the day Don Bradman got his duck in cricket. Number 4, the next option that I am proposing as to what would make a good Australia Day. I'm going to go for the 9th of June. And that would achieve a number of things. That would pretty much perfectly keep the balance of when we celebrate the King's birthday versus when we celebrate Australia Day. We're just swapping the 2 dates over. The reason why the 9th of June is that is the day Matthew Flinders finished his circumnavigation of Australia and called it Australia because Terra Australis sounded too bad. And basically, this is also a way of kind of laughing at ourselves because Matthew Flinders would have given up on finding Antarctica, which he believed was the Great Southern Land. And so he settled to call Terra Australis, land of the South. He settled to call Australia, or New Holland, Terra Australis, because that was the closest thing that they could find. And so you're actually just celebrating the naming of Australia. It's not the British planting the flag in the ground. At this point, we have Indigenous and British societies intermingling, though obviously in varying degrees as to whether it was positive or negative. But it's just simple. This is the day that Australia was called Australia. So kind of in the same way that you kind of have a christening or a naming day for a baby or something like that, we're going to celebrate the naming of Australia. I don't think that's not celebrating genocide or anything like that. Again, Matthew Flinders was an explorer, couple of negative accounts alongside George Bass. But realistically, not celebrating him or his life. We're just celebrating the fact that we call ourselves Australia. And really, does it matter how the circumstances around our naming? Again, like not a lot of you guys wouldn't have chosen your names or wouldn't have liked the names that your parents gave. Or a lot of people have very negative relationships with their parents, but still keep the name that their parents gave them. It doesn't really matter the way that we got named Australia. It's just simple. It's celebrating the day we got our name and started to then gain for ourselves a unique, distinct identity. So I think that is also another possible solution to move forward. And it's pretty much just swapping King's birthday with Australia Day and then celebrating the day we were actually called Australia. Same thing as Don Bradman's Day. The con there would be that it falls in winter. And so you'd have to watch NRL or AFL as opposed to cricket. Okay, option number 3. I am going for November the 13th. And these next two are going to be very close to each other in date. November the 13th. What happened on November the 13th? Well, if we go back to World War II, and specifically we go back to 1942, it is the liberation of Kokoda. And it is the victory for the Australians in the Battle of Kokoda. It's not a victory in the broader New Guinea campaign. A lot still needs to be done. And so the 39th Battalion would then need to move further north and take the north and then move further west. And if you kind of know your history, you know that Douglas MacArthur kind of withdrew them and put in American troops. Those American troops didn't do so well in Boona, so he had to then withdraw those American troops and put back in Australian troops. So there's lots of different parts about New Guinea that we, could make reference to. The reason why I am going for Kokoda is basically same thing as Paul Keating's arguments. It's celebrating the self-defense of Australia in World War II. It's commemorating the fact that this was the, birth of Australia going into Asia. Again, our relationship with Japan really started after World War II. And though obviously we were fighting against them in World War II, it was the beginning of a relationship and a partnership with Japan. Indigenous soldiers were involved in that defense. And so we've got Indigenous soldiers and Australian soldiers. So Indigenous soldiers, that's going to be terrible. If I wasn't the media, that would be soundbited so bad. Indigenous soldiers and Australian soldiers. You know what I mean? Indigenous soldiers and white soldiers, far out. I'm glad this is only going out to 400 people. That would be that's like, what did Joe Biden say when he was like, there's white Americans and there's poor Americans or something like that. You guys, I'm trusting you there not to cancel me. So we've got Indigenous soldiers and white soldiers that are fighting side by side in the trenches. Sorry, not the literal trenches. It's just in Kokoda, and it's basically the defeat of the Japanese, victory for Australia, and it is done in the most heroic of circumstances, fighting along particularly Imata Ridge, but just the broader Kokoda track. Again, with exhaustion, with the terrible jungle conditions, it was an incredible victory for Australia. And so November the 13th, you get summer, you probably even get a little bit of cricket if, Cricket Australia could organise themselves around it. And we're celebrating the day. Now, this only does come 2 days after Remembrance Day, which is important to remember. But we are celebrating the day that we effectively fought off the Japanese in Kokoda. And pretty much ruled out any possibility of a Japanese invasion. So we're celebrating the self-defense of Australia in its most heroic moment in war. And so I think that would be a cool one to celebrate because it's Indigenous soldiers and white soldiers fighting together to protect Australia. And so it's a shared experience where we're unified against a common enemy. And sometimes you have to have an enemy out there to unify two disparate groups of people. And so I think that could be a really, really cool one to celebrate in that respect. But I don't think it actually gets as close as what number 2 and number 1 would have. So they're my 5, 4, 3. Number 2, what would be the second best day to celebrate Australia Day in my mind? And I am going for the qualification for the 2005 World Cup. Sorry, I take that back. 2006 World Cup. It was 2005 that we qualified for the 2006 World Cup. PY would be furious with me for saying that. I've had a couple of slip-ups today. Anyway, why would I pick this date as a date to celebrate Australia Day? Well, I think there's a couple of good reasons for it. Firstly, soccer represents the migrant component of the Australian identity. So again, like particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, a lot of the Australian team is of broadly Mediterranean descent in some way, shape or form. Mostly Croat would be the primary one there. So it's a celebration of migrant culture because it's a team of migrants, either first generation, second generation, or third generation migrants that have, I guess, formed a team together and have qualified for the World Cup. A couple other reasons why I think it'd be a good one though. The difficulty of the challenge. And some people here might be thinking, well, the Matildas reached a semi-final of a World Cup. This is just qualifying for a World Cup. I think in the context, this is really important. It was extremely difficult for Australia to qualify for the World Cup under those existing arrangements. So again, we just also got to account for the fact when it comes to women's football versus men's football, Australia has always been a more dominant force in women's football because we're a first world economy. That typically is how it works. And so we would have some of the most socially progressive beliefs in the world, which works really well for women's football because it encourages women to play sport. You look at who the dominant nations are in women's football, it's Scandinavian or America. You look in men's football, and that is not the case. Scandinavia and America do not dominate men's football the same way they do in women's football because in second world developing countries, football is encouraged and it's an outlet for men specifically. Women are not encouraged to pursue it the same way. And so I do think it actually makes a much more competitive field, but I don't want to risk going full Joey Barton on this one. What I would say as well is that under the old arrangement, to qualify for the World Cup for a country from Oceania was extremely difficult. So Australia was way better than all the countries around us. New Zealand weren't really much of a challenge. And then after that, you're looking at like the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa. Never any of those countries ever posed a threat to, bar New Zealand 1 year, to being the top of the table in Oceania. But because Oceania is such a bad part of the world when it comes to football, FIFA did not give direct qualification for the person or for the team who topped Oceania. Instead, the team who becomes the top of Oceania has to go to a playoff with one of the, I think it was sixth, I'm going to say sixth, the sixth place team in South America. And so in 2002, we faced Uruguay and we lost to Uruguay. And then for the 2006 World Cup, we faced Uruguay again. And it's also important just to state how good this Uruguay team was. Like, this was not a bad Uruguay team at all. Diego Forlan, hugely successful player, was in his younger years. Alvaro Recoba, one of Uruguay's best ever players, was in his prime. And it was a strong team that we're up against. The proof was in the pudding. Uruguay did qualify for the next World Cup and they reached the semi-finals of that World Cup in pretty spectacular fashion. So we were up against a very good Uruguay team. Our team was also pretty good for the time as well, much better than our current Socceroos squad is. But you look at who's on the field, you've got like Harry Kuehl, who I think was from Fairfield. You've got Mark Viduka, Croat Victorian. And then you just kind of go around the field, like the names, just like Marco Bresciano, Italian, Jason Collina. I don't know where he was actually from. Mile Stojovski. And you just kind of like look around the field, you've got kind of, I guess, people of white Anglo background, so like, Craig Moore, Lucas Neal, Harry Kewell. You've got migrant background. Unfortunately, the one thing that I think is restrictive in making this a National Australia Day is the fact that we didn't have many Indigenous players that were in the that were near the starting 11. We had guys like Travis Dodd, but they never really got capped that many times by the Socceroos. And so perhaps that's kind of the one limitation there. But you had Archie Thompson, who I think, if I'm not mistaken, mix of Maori descent and Torres Strait Islander descent in and around the squad as well. What I would say is that it was just a huge date that is in the consciousness of people's minds that we all celebrated together. People who didn't like soccer were really excited at this. I was a very little kid, but I remember it quite distinctly. I remember the penalty shootout. I remember John Aloisi hitting his winning goal, running away. What I also have heard lots of people say is, like, my friend that's a couple years older than me, he was like, I just ran out onto the street in celebration. I just kind of lost control, and then saw that my next door neighbor had also just run out onto the street in celebration and lost control. And so we had this weird moment where we were just like celebrating on the street together, having not really spoken that often in our lives before. And so it's a date that's in recent memory where we all celebrated as a nation together. There was no sense of division in the nation. Again, whether across political stripes or across cultural stripes, soccer as well was known for being the most divisive, I guess, movement. Like, soccer was more divisive than politics in Australia throughout the 90s. And you actually just had ethnic division, like literal ethnic division amongst different teams in different pockets of Sydney and different pockets of Melbourne, where the rivalry was, you are a different, you're a second generation of a different migrant nationality to us. This means war. All of that, and I mean all of that, was put to the side when Australia qualified for the 2006 World Cup. That was the second time, so we did qualify back in the 70s. This was significantly harder to qualify for than in the 1970s, and we've qualified many a time since, but it has been much easier to qualify since going into Asia, because we don't have to play that playoff game unless we finish, I think, third in our table in Asia. Whereas we finish first, we do all we can. We're beating countries like America, Samoa 31-0, but that every time would put us up. Like, one time to qualify, we had to play against Diego Maradona's Argentina, and we lost. So, like, the fact that we qualified for the 2006 World Cup was nothing short of a miracle. Yes, we had a good team at the time, and if we were in another part of the world, we probably would have. But the fact that we had to play off against Uruguay and beat them in the most dramatic of circumstances, coming from behind to then win and hold our nerve in the penalty shootout, I think was just a huge national day of celebration. It's in November, a good time of the year to have an Australia Day. If only we had a prominent Indigenous athlete in the team, so we could go, this was all three parts of Australian society, all three contributors to Australian culture coming together to celebrate a great triumph together. And so I think that's the missing component the missing ingredient for why that would make a good Australia Day. Before we get to number one, I've got two honourable mentions, which could never happen because it wouldn't have broad political consensus and it would seem as too preferential towards Labor for a national holiday. First one is December the 3rd, make the Eureka Stockade Australia Day. That'd be pretty boss, right, to celebrate, people demanding that they be treated with dignity and respect and with proper economic rights. I think that wouldn't be the worst thing to instill into a national consciousness. I think it would boost union membership, and I think that would be it just channels the Australian spirit, right? But obviously that we cannot be seen to go for treason, which was what it was at the time. We can't celebrate a day of sedition as a national holiday, unfortunately. So I think that one is ruled out for that reason. The other one that I think would be fun, but definitely wouldn't get national consensus, would be April the 1st. That is the first round of stimulus packages that Kevin Rudd gave out in 2009. I think, look, say what you want. The fact that we were in growth and the rest of the world was in recession, and you've heard me say it 1,000 times now, is worthy of celebration. That was an incredible economic feat. And I think you could make an argument that it honours both Liberal and Labor, because Kevin Rudd spent a surplus that Howard left. That's the way that you could frame it to kind of get bipartisan support for it. But imagine Australia Day, like, go out, stimulate the economy, go to a store, buy something for yourself, and like just have a national day of economic stimulation. I think that'd be pretty funny. And also a way that we kind of recognize that historically our government has done some pretty incredible things relative to other governments in the world. And I think it kind of help for kind of reducing bitterness and cynicism towards the government. And I think that would be a pretty funny way to celebrate Australia Day, but obviously I don't think you would get much of the population going for it. Also, it kind of creates a deity-like cult of personality around Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan. One could argue that Kevin Rudd wouldn't be too disappointed with that, but maybe let's not deify our politicians could be a possible argument against it. So, what is our number one date to celebrate Australia? I reckon most of you have gotten. I reckon most of you guessed it by now. I gave some pretty strong clues in the Socceroos one as to what was missing and what would make the perfect Australia Day. And I think the perfect day to celebrate Australia Day is September the 15th. September the 15th, 2000, Cathy Freeman wins gold at the Sydney Olympics. Like it is perfect for so many reasons. So number one, it is an athletic triumph, a huge athletic triumph to win in the 400. That is a brutal race. Like I used to do a bit of running, and so like I worked hard to break 60 seconds in the 400 meters. I got down to about 58 seconds. Cathy Freeman shaved I can't even remember what her time was, but she would have shaved like 10 seconds off of that. And so it's an incredible athletic triumph to win gold in a brutally hard race. That is way tougher than the 100 meters. It's because it's sprinting for the whole time, but it's very tough to hold a sprint for anywhere near that long. So the first reason why is it promotes optimism around the Australian spirit. This is what you can do if you work hard at something, and it's celebrating just this huge Australian triumph on the global stage. Second reason why I think it works. Again, the argument that I have against Australia Day is that it doesn't celebrate Indigenous contribution to the Australian identity. This was a pretty huge Indigenous contribution to the Australian identity, winning Australia's most famous ever gold medal by a mile. Sorry, Thorpe, I think you're a little bit behind Cathy Freeman there. Third reason why, the Olympics is a celebration of British contribution to Australian culture as well. In order to get the Olympics, you need to have the hallmarks of a, industrial and urban society. You cannot have an Olympics in a village. Ironic because it's called the Olympic Village, I know. But you can't have an Olympics in a rural village. It has to be in a big urbanized city with a lot of infrastructure in place. And so I think that's the perfect way to celebrate British contribution to Australian culture, because we celebrate the fact that, we do have cities now in Australia. And we do have, we've imported from, just Western society, megacities, or megacities probably right, big cities that are capable of hosting the world for something like the Olympics. I think it's also a way to celebrate because it's hosting the world in our country. And so the world's eyes were on us for those 2 weeks in 2000, as they will be in Brisbane in 2032. And obviously, I know we had the Melbourne one a little bit before that. And also at the same time, I think it totally celebrates migrant culture because we're inviting all the countries to come to our country. And the 2000 Olympics, you can look back on and look at a litany of gold medalists. So I think we celebrate Cathy Freeman. That's the day that we choose. But we're just broadly celebrating the 2000 Olympics, where all sorts of athletes from all sorts of backgrounds won gold medals and really put a lot of prestige on Australia's name in the eyes of the world. And so for me, I'm like, that just makes so much sense to make that an Australia Day. It's not a complex bit of history. It's not something that will bore people. It's a very easy bit of history to digest. She ran fast and won the 400 meters. And I think it just celebrates so many different parts of Australian culture. And really, it's a part that everyone feels as though they have some degree of involvement with. And it's also just, it's a part that many people in Australia will remember. Unfortunately, my luck is that I lived in London for the Sydney Olympics and I lived in Sydney for the London Olympics. So I've kind of missed each run. So I wasn't actually in the country, but I've heard Cathy Freeman's race told to me by a lot of people throughout time. So I think that would just make the perfect day to celebrate Australia Day. And it's also it's not exactly equidistant, but it's pretty equidistant in terms of when we space out King's birthday and Australia Day. So you go King's birthday on January the 26th, and then September the 15th, you're busy, you're tired, you've just had end of financial year, you've pushed through the winter, the sun's starting to come out, and as the sun is starting to come out, you have Australia Day. And you've got NRL and AFL finals that you can enjoy. Make sure one of those finals falls on that day so you can tune in, watch the footy, And yeah, whether you're Sydney or Victorian or whatever your kind of proclivity is, so to speak, you can get your footy finals of your choice. I just think it would make an awesome day. And so if I was a dictator of a country, I would go January the 26th is the King's birthday, because in this society we're somehow still a monarchy and a dictatorship. That definitely works in this fictional universe. And then on September the 15th, we would be celebrating Australia Day. Cathy Freeman's gold would be broadcast all over every year. And hopefully the change the date debate would be over and we would be living harmoniously celebrating this date together. I don't know. I'm curious to know what you think. What would be the best path forward? I'm not interested in is it right or wrong to celebrate Australia Day on Australia Day. I think that's a really boring debate that doesn't really achieve anything. But in terms of the way forward, how can we best possibly celebrate a positive sense of Australian nationality? I think this could be a really cool way of doing it that still gets the best of both worlds, and it doesn't celebrate Australia on a date that on the planting of the British flag. Celebrates a British thing for the planting of the British flag, and then a broader Australian thing for the contribution of everyone to Australia. Curious to know what you think. I think that could be a possible way forward that would avoid all of this. I don't know how Cathy Freeman would feel about being given deity status in Australian folklore, but I guess whatever day you celebrate, you're celebrating the contribution of someone. So do we deify Arthur Phillip or do we deify Cathy Freeman? Curious to know what you think in the comments. Let me know. Yeah,